The night swallows everything. It's the 2nd of May, 1863, and the Virginia forest around Chancellorsville breathes with an unsettling silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums. The kind that makes every snapped twig sound like a gunshot. Somewhere in the suffocating darkness, a general sits on his horse, flush with victory. His men have just executed one of the most daring flanking maneuvers in American military history. The enemy is in disarray. Triumph hangs in the air like morning mist. Then, a volley of musket fire tears through the trees. The general lurches in his saddle. His left arm shatters. His right hand takes a round. Another ball punches into his palm. In the span of 3 seconds, the architect of Confederate success becomes its most tragic casualty. Not from a Union sharpshooter's careful aim, but from the panicked fingers of his own North Carolina regiment. Men who would have died for him just killed him instead. How does a general survive countless battles only to fall to friendly fire in his moment of greatest triumph? If you were standing in those trees, with rumors of enemy cavalry swirling through camp and shadows moving in every direction, would you have pulled the trigger too? History is full of these forgotten lessons, moments where the fog of war became a funeral shroud, where victory and disaster stood so close together they wore the same uniform. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the archives, join us by subscribing, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never made it into the textbooks. Thomas Jonathan Jackson didn't look like a legend. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a scraggly beard and a uniform that perpetually appeared one size too large. His boots were scuffed. His posture was odd. He had a habit of holding one arm raised, claiming it balanced the circulation. Fellow officers whispered that he was eccentric at best, unhinged at worst. He sucked on lemons during strategy meetings. He refused to fight on Sundays when possible. He was a devout Presbyterian who believed God personally guided every Confederate bullet. But on the battlefield, Thomas Jackson transformed into something else entirely. They called him Stonewall after the First Battle of Bull Run, where his brigade held a defensive position with such immovable determination that a fellow general shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The nickname stuck like gospel. By the spring of 1863, Stonewall Jackson had become Robert E. Lee's most trusted commander, the sharp edge of the Confederate sword, the man who turned impossible maneuvers into devastating victories. And on May 2nd, he had just pulled off his masterpiece. The Battle of Chancellorsville was already shaping up to be Lee's most audacious gamble. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General Joseph Hooker, had crossed the Rappahannock River with over 130,000 men. Lee had barely 60,000. The mathematics of war suggested retreat. Every textbook screamed caution. Lee and Jackson chose madness instead. Picture the strategy meeting. It's the evening of May 1st. Candles flicker in a clearing near the crossroads. Lee and Jackson sit on hardtack boxes, a crude map spread between them. The situation is grim. They're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Hooker's forces have superior positioning. The smart play is obvious. Fall back, preserve the army, live to fight another day. Lee looks at Jackson. Jackson looks at the map. Then Jackson traces a line with his finger, a sweeping arc through the dense wilderness forest that will take his entire corps around the Union right flank. 12 miles through tangled undergrowth and forgotten logging roads. 12 miles where a single Union scout could spot the movement and turn Lee's divided army into a massacre. 12 miles that would leave Lee with only 14,000 men to face Hooker's main force. It was brilliant. It was insane. It was both. "My troops will move at 4 o'clock in the morning," Jackson said, in that clipped, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything from ordering breakfast to ordering flanking maneuvers that would rewrite military doctrine. Lee nodded, because if anyone could pull this off, it was a man who held his arm up to balance his circulation. Dawn broke on May 2nd with Confederate soldiers moving like ghosts. 28,000 men filed through the forest in a column that stretched for miles. They marched in near silence, instructed to avoid conversation, to keep their canteens from rattling, to become invisible. The wilderness was aptly named, a claustrophobic maze of second-growth timber, dense thickets, and vine-choked ravines where sunlight barely penetrated. The The kind of terrain where you could lose an entire regiment 50 yards off the path. Union forces spotted them. Of course they did. You can't move 30,000 men through a forest without someone noticing. Federal officers reported the movement to Hooker. They described long columns of Confederate troops heading south. Hooker, sitting in his headquarters at the Chancellor Family Tavern, made the single most catastrophic assumption of his military career. He decided Jackson was retreating. The reports fit the narrative Hooker wanted to believe. Lee was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Naturally, he would withdraw. The movement through the wilderness wasn't a flanking maneuver. It was the beginning of a Confederate withdrawal. Hooker sent a few units to probe the column, but otherwise remained static, convinced he had Lee exactly where he wanted him. Meanwhile, Jackson's corps kept marching, past the Union pickets, past the confused Federal cavalry, past the point of no return. By late afternoon, they had reached the Union right flank. Major General Oliver Otis Howard commanded the Union 11th Corps, positioned on the Army's right flank near a place called Talley's Farm. His men were relaxed. Some were cooking dinner. Others played cards. A few had stacked their rifles to build campfires. The prevailing mood was one of comfortable certainty. The Confederates were retreating. The battle was essentially won, and soon they'd be marching on Richmond. Then the deer started running. Soldiers looked up from their meals to see white-tailed deer bursting from the western tree line, eyes wide with panic. Rabbits followed, then squirrels. Every creature with functioning survival instincts was fleeing east, away from something in the forest. Howard's men barely had time to wonder why. At 5:15 in the evening, the tree line exploded with the rebel yell, that high-pitched, keening shriek that Union soldiers would describe in letters home as the sound of hell itself. 28,000 Confederate soldiers crashed through the undergrowth in a tidal wave of butternut and gray. They weren't retreating. They had never been retreating. Howard's corps disintegrated. Men dropped their dinner plates and ran. Entire regiments collapsed in minutes. The few units that tried to form defensive lines were overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of Jackson's assault. The surprise was so complete, the shock so total, that organized resistance became impossible. The Union right flank didn't just break, it vaporized. Jackson sat on his horse, watching his plan unfold with the precision of a watchmaker's gears. Everything was working. Everything was perfect. And that's when the fog of war began its slow, inevitable descent. Darkness came early in the wilderness. By 7 o'clock, the forest was a nightmare of shadows and confusion. Units became separated. Officers shouted contradictory orders into the gloom. The Confederate advance, so devastating in daylight, began to lose cohesion in the dark. Jackson knew he needed to maintain momentum. A night attack was dangerous, unconventional, potentially disastrous. But then again, so was everything else he'd done that day. He decided to personally scout the ground ahead, to find the routes his men would use to continue the assault. He gathered a small party of officers and rode forward into the darkness between the lines, into that terrible space where friend and enemy wore uniforms that looked identical in the night, where every sound could be a threat, where 19-year-old sentries stood with sweating palms and twitching trigger fingers. The general who had executed military perfection was about to become its victim, and the men who would kill him had no idea what they were about to do. There's a particular quality to darkness in dense forest that maps cannot convey. The cartographers who sketched the wilderness for Confederate headquarters drew clean lines and neat symbols. They marked roads as if they were actual roads, not overgrown deer paths that disappeared into thickets. They indicated open ground that was, in reality, a tangle of briars thick enough to shred cloth and skin. Most critically, they drew clear boundaries between Confederate and Union positions, as if war arranged itself in tidy rows, as if armies occupied space the way ink occupies paper. The men standing in those forests knew better. By 8 o'clock on the evening of May 2nd, the front line had become a concept rather than a location. Confederate regiments had pushed forward in uneven surges, some advancing half a mile, others bogged down in confusion. Union forces had retreated in equally chaotic fashion, with some units making organized withdrawals while others simply scattered. Between these two dissolving masses lay a gray zone of perhaps 300 yards where neither side held clear control. This was the space Jackson chose to enter. Lieutenant Joseph Morrison watched his brother-in-law mount his horse and felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. Morrison served on Jackson's staff, close enough to recognize the general's moods. Tonight, Jackson radiated an almost manic energy, the aftermath of perfect victory mixing with the urgency to exploit it. The general wanted to scout forward personally, to find the roads that would allow a night assault to continue the devastation. It was bold. It was necessary. It was also profoundly dangerous. The party numbered somewhere between 15 and 20 officers and couriers. Accounts vary, which tells you something about the confusion already present. They rode east on a mountain road, a generous name for what was essentially a rutted path through the trees. The darkness pressed close. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in scattered fragments, creating a shifting mosaic of silver and shadow that played tricks on depth perception. Captain Richard Wilburn, Jackson's signal officer, rode near the front. He would later describe the sensation as swimming through ink. Every 50 yards, they paused to listen. The forest amplified sounds in strange ways. A voice of the Confederate lines might sound close while a musket shot from 20 yards away could seem distant and muffled. They passed through their own picket lines around 8:30. A North Carolina regiment, the 18th, had established forward positions along the road. The soldiers recognized Jackson. His odd posture, his oversized coat, the way he sat his horse with one hand raised. They let the party pass with whispered acknowledgments. That was the last moment anyone knew exactly where Jackson was. Colonel Edward Warren commanded a section of Confederate line about 200 yards south of Mountain Road. At approximately 8:45, he heard hoofbeats approaching from the east, from the direction of Union lines. Warren was a competent officer, which meant he was paranoid. Federal cavalry had been probing Confederate positions all evening. Rumors circulated that Union horsemen were attempting to infiltrate the lines, to cause chaos and capture officers in the dark. Warren called out a challenge. No response came, or at least none. He could hear over the ambient noise of shifting troops and distant skirmishing. He ordered his men to prepare to fire. Then the hoofbeats changed direction, moving north toward Mountain Road, and the moment passed. Warren never reported this encounter. Why would he? Nothing happened. Just another phantom contact in a night full of them. But those hoofbeats were Jackson's party. Already disoriented, already off course. The general and his staff had encountered Union pickets and wheeled away, inadvertently moving parallel to their own lines rather than back through them. They were now riding through that gray zone where maps turned into suggestions and landmarks disappeared into shadows. Nobody in the scouting party realized they were lost. Or rather, nobody realized they were lost in a way that mattered. They knew their general location, somewhere between the armies, east of their starting point. What they didn't know was that they had drifted south of the road they'd originally taken, and were now approaching a different section of Confederate line, a section manned by troops who hadn't seen them leave. Major John Berry stood behind his regiment and tried to manage the impossible task of maintaining order in chaos. The 18th North Carolina had been in position for perhaps 45 minutes. They were part of Lane's brigade, rushed forward during the evening assault to hold the gains Jackson's attack had made. Most of Berry's men were young, teenagers and men in their early 20s who had never fought a night action before. They'd spent the last hour listening to officers shout contradictory information about Union positions, about cavalry raids, about the desperate importance of holding this section of line. The atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. Earlier that evening, Lane's brigade had fired on their own troops by mistake. The 37th North Carolina, advancing in the darkness, had been mistaken for Union forces and received a volley from their comrades. Men had fallen screaming. The error was discovered only when survivors shouted their identity loud enough to penetrate the confusion. Now every soldier in Lane's brigade carried that mistake in their minds. The knowledge that they just killed their own, that the darkness made friend and foe identical. Berry emphasized a simple rule. Anything approaching from the east was hostile. The Union Army was to the east. Therefore, movement from the east meant enemy. It was a reasonable heuristic under the circumstances. It was also about to become catastrophic. Around 9 o'clock, Private William Cummings heard horses. Cummings was 18 years old, and had been in the Army for 7 months. He crouched behind a fallen log, musket ready, tried to peer through vegetation that seemed deliberately designed to obscure everything important. The hoofbeats were unmistakable now. Multiple horses, moving at a walk, coming from the direction every officer had identified as enemy territory. Cummings' hands began to sweat despite the cool night air. Next to him, Corporal David Kyle whispered, "You see them?" "Shapes," Cummings replied. "Maybe 4 or 5 riders." The shapes materialized slowly, emerging from the forest like ghosts gaining substance. Dark coats, wide-brimmed hats. The silhouettes looked wrong somehow, but in the darkness, everything looked wrong. The riders moved with purpose, but not quite enough caution. They seemed to be surveying the ground, occasionally stopping to gesture at landmarks invisible to Cummings. Someone down the line hissed a warning. The sound rippled through the regiment. Hostile cavalry, possible scouts. Hold fire until ordered. Major Barry moved up behind the line, trying to see what his men were seeing. He spotted the riders. His stomach clenched. Federal cavalry. Had to be. Nothing else made sense. But Barry was a careful officer. He called out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The riders didn't respond. Or rather, they responded, but not in any way Barry could interpret. Some accounts suggest they called back an identification, but the words were swallowed by distance and the ambient noise of an army trying to reorganize in darkness. Other witnesses claimed the riders simply continued forward, apparently unconcerned by the challenge. What actually happened was worse. Jackson's party heard the challenge, but Jackson himself gave no order to respond clearly. He was focused on the terrain ahead, his mind already calculating approach routes for the next phase of attack. His staff officers assumed someone else would handle the identification. The civilian guide with them, David Kyle, no relation to the corporal, tried to shout back, but his voice lacked the carrying power needed. The failure to communicate took perhaps 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which Major Barry had to make a decision based on incomplete information while bearing the fresh memory of his brigade's earlier fratricide. The riders were still moving. They hadn't stopped at the challenge. From Barry's position, this looked like hostile action. Enemy scouts brazenly surveying Confederate positions, confident in the darkness that provided cover. Barry made his choice. Fire on them. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical precision of falling dominoes. The 18th North Carolina's right companies fired first, maybe 30 muskets releasing their loads in a ragged volley that lit up the forest with orange muzzle flashes. The sound was enormous, a physical pressure wave that seemed to compress the air itself. On Mountain Road, horses reared and men shouted in confusion and sudden terror. Captain Wilburn felt something tug at his coat. Later, he would find the hole where a ball had passed through the fabric an inch from his ribs. Lieutenant Morrison's horse collapsed, shot through the neck. The animal fell in convulsive spasms, pinning Morrison's leg briefly before he wrenched free. And Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, who had faced artillery barges with serene calm, who had ridden through countless firefights without flinching, instinctively turned his horse to flee back toward Confederate lines. It was exactly the wrong direction. His horse, a powerful sorrel named Little Sorrel, bolted not west toward safety but south, deeper into the trees, directly toward another section of Lane's brigade. Jackson tried to control the panicked animal while simultaneously ducking low in the saddle. His raised arm, the one he kept elevated for circulation, came down to grab the reins. Behind him, the 18th North Carolina realized they'd fired on something, but the darkness prevented any assessment of what. Officers shouted for a ceasefire, but the order competed with other officers shouting to prepare for a counterattack. The confusion multiplied. Some men reloaded, others held fire. A few broke ranks to advance and confirm the contact. Jackson's party scattered in all directions. Some riders made it back to Confederate lines. Others dove from their horses and sought cover in the underbrush. Captain Wilburn found himself separated from everyone, crouching behind a tree while trying to understand what had just happened. And Jackson, still fighting his terrified horse, emerged from the tree line directly in front of the 18th North Carolina center companies. The soldiers saw a rider burst from the forest at full gallop, coat billowing, clearly fleeing from their own volley. It looked exactly like a Union cavalry scout who had just been fired upon and was now trying to escape. Someone shouted, "Pour it into them, boys." The second volley was more concentrated than the first. Perhaps 40 muskets fired simultaneously at a target less than 30 yards away. The muzzle flashes created a strobing effect that froze the scene in amber. A rider, a horse, a moment crystallized in light and smoke, an irreversible consequence. 3 balls hit Jackson, his left arm below the shoulder, his right hand, his left palm. The impact knocked him sideways in the saddle. Little Sorrel, driven to absolute terror, ran directly toward a low-hanging branch. Jackson, barely conscious, couldn't duck in time. The branch caught him across the face and chest, sweeping him off the horse like a giant hand brushing away an insect. He hit the ground and didn't move. The men who had just shot him had no idea what they'd done. In the darkness, they couldn't identify their target. They saw only that they'd hit something, and that whatever was had stopped moving. A few soldiers approached cautiously, muskets ready, expecting to find a dead Federal cavalryman. Instead, they found their general bleeding in the dirt. And in that moment, every decision that seemed reasonable, every precaution, every warning, every logical response to incomplete information revealed itself as a thread in a tapestry of catastrophic error. The architects of victory had just destroyed their own masterwork. Private James Frazier reached the fallen rider first. His hands shook as he knelt beside the body, musket still clutched in one hand, while the other reached tentatively toward the figure sprawled in the dirt. The man's coat was soaked. Frazier couldn't tell if it was sweat or blood or both. The face was turned away, partially obscured by the brim of a hat that had somehow remained on despite the fall. Then the man groaned. Frazier recoiled instinctively, bringing his weapon up, before his brain processed what his ears had heard. That wasn't the sound of an enemy. That was the sound of someone in profound agony, someone who needed help, someone who... He turned to face toward what little moonlight penetrated the canopy. The beard, the odd features, the familiar, eccentric profile that belonged to the one man in the Confederate Army everyone could identify by silhouette alone. "Oh, God," Frazier whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking, "Oh, God, it's Jackson. We've shot General Jackson." The words detonated through the 18th North Carolina like artillery fire. Men who had been reloading froze with ramrods halfway down barrels. Officers who had been shouting orders fell silent mid-sentence. The entire regiment seemed to inhale collectively and forget to breathe out. Captain William Lee pushed through the stunned soldiers, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had heard. Not Jackson. Couldn't be Jackson. Jackson was somewhere behind the lines, planning the next movement, doing what Jackson did. Jackson didn't ride into no man's land. Jackson didn't. He looked down. Stonewall Jackson lay on his back, conscious but fading, blood pooling beneath him in quantities that looked black in the darkness. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle. His right hand was mangled. When he tried to speak, the words came out slurred and dreamlike, as if he were narrating events happening to someone else. "My own men," Jackson murmured, not angry, just confused, genuinely perplexed that the mathematics of war had produced this particular equation. Captain Lee made a decision that probably saved Jackson's life and definitely prolonged his suffering. They needed to move the general immediately. Union forces were less than 300 yards away, and the sound of gunfire would draw attention. But moving a man with Jackson's injuries without a stretcher in darkness through dense forest while trying to avoid detection was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a medical catastrophe. 6 men volunteered to carry him. They fashioned a crude litter from muskets and blankets, working with the frantic efficiency of soldiers who understood they'd just committed the worst mistake imaginable and desperately needed to somehow undo it. Jackson was lifted with painful gentleness, each movement eliciting sounds that made the bearers wince. They started back toward Confederate lines at approximately 9:20. The journey should have taken 10 minutes. It took nearly an hour. The path, barely visible even in daylight, became an obstacle course of roots, deadfall, and grasping undergrowth. The bearers stumbled constantly. Each stumble jolted Jackson's shattered arm. Each jolt produced a sound that was somehow worse than screaming, a sharp, inhaled hiss of someone trying desperately not to make noise even while experiencing agony. Then the Union artillery opened fire. Federal gunners had heard the musket volleys and made the reasonable assumption that Confederate forces were maneuvering for a night attack. They couldn't see specific targets, so they did what artillerists do when fighting in darkness. They fired into the general area where they thought the enemy might be, hoping mathematics and luck would guide their shells to something vital. One of those shells exploded in the trees directly above Jackson's litter party. The concussion knocked two bearers off their feet. The litter tilted violently, spilling Jackson onto the ground. His shattered arm struck a protruding root. This time he did scream, a sound so raw and terrible that it would haunt the men who heard it for the rest of their lives. They picked him up again, kept moving. Another shell burst nearby, showering them with shredded bark and metal fragments. One bearer took shrapnel in the shoulder, but didn't dare drop his corner of the litter. They pushed through smoke that burned their eyes and made breathing feel like inhaling fire. Behind them, the entire front line was dissolving into chaos as Union artillery found its range. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill had assumed temporary command of Jackson's corps when the general rode forward to scout. He was conferring with his division commanders when a courier arrived at full gallop, the horse lathered and wild-eyed. The courier's first attempt to speak produced only gasping sounds. His second attempt came out as a jumbled rush of words that Hill's brain initially rejected as impossible. General Jackson shot our own men. Major Berry, 3 wounds. Hill felt the ground tilt beneath him, not metaphorically, the actual sensation of vertigo, as if reality had suddenly decided to obey different physics. He made the courier repeat everything slowly, hoping that clarity would somehow transform the information into something that made sense. It didn't. Hill immediately mounted and rode toward the reported location, his staff officers trailing behind in stunned silence. They encountered Jackson's litter party approximately half a mile from front line, moving at an agonizing pace through artillery fire that seemed determined to finish what friendly muskets had started. Hill dismounted and approached the litter with the care of someone approaching a sacred relic that had been inexplicably shattered. Jackson's eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. Blood had soaked through multiple layers of makeshift bandaging. "General," Hill said softly, "it's Powell. We're getting you to the surgeons." Jackson's eyes found him. For a moment, clarity returned. "General Hill," he whispered, "you must prepare for the enemy. They will be upon us at daylight." Even dying, even in shock, Jackson was issuing tactical assessments. Then another shell screamed overhead. Closer this time, close enough that everyone instinctively ducked. The explosion caught Hill's horse squarely, killing the animal instantly and sending fragments of metal singing through the trees. One piece caught Hill in the calf, dropping him to one knee. The situation had progressed from tragic to farcical to nightmarish. The corps commander was wounded. The general was dying. Union artillery was systematically destroying everything in a half-mile radius. And somewhere in the darkness, over 100,000 Union soldiers were preparing to counterattack a Confederate force that had just accidentally decapitated its own command structure. Dr. Hunter McGuire had been tending to routine casualties when they brought Jackson in. McGuire was a skilled surgeon by Civil War standards, which meant he was proficient at amputations and had a statistically better than average record of not killing his patients through infection. He took one look at Jackson's left arm and knew what had to happen. The bones were shattered beyond any possibility of setting. The ball had severed the main artery, and Jackson had already lost quantities of blood that would have killed a weaker man. If the arm stayed attached, infection would develop, and in 1863, infection meant death in roughly 90% of cases. McGuire administered chloroform. Jackson slipped into unconsciousness with that same confused expression, as if he were trying to solve a mathematical problem that refused to follow proper rules. The amputation took McGuire 14 minutes. He worked by candlelight while artillery shells continued to fall outside, creating a surreal counterpoint. The delicate work of surgery punctuated by explosions that shook the tent poles and made instruments rattle on their trays. The arm came off 2 inches below the shoulder. McGuire sutured the arteries. clothes wound with careful stitching, and applied bandages with the grim efficiency of someone who had performed this procedure hundreds of times. The right hand's wounds were less severe. He extracted bone fragments, cleaned the entry wounds, and wrapped them tightly. Jackson would survive the surgery. Whether he would survive what came after was a different question entirely. Outside the tent, word of Jackson's wounding spread through Confederate ranks like poison in a water supply. Units that had been preparing to resume the assault simply stopped. Officers looked at each other with expressions that mixed shock, grief, and something darker, the creeping realization that they had just witnessed the impossible. The man who couldn't be stopped had been stopped by his own army. The architect of perfect victory had been destroyed by the tools he wielded. The legend of Stonewall had shattered against the same fog of war that he'd exploited so brilliantly against his enemies. Robert E. Lee received the news at approximately 11 o'clock. He was in his headquarters tent, studying maps by lamplight, when Major Alexander Pendleton entered with the expression of someone delivering news of apocalypse. Pendleton's voice cracked as he reported, Jackson wounded, command uncertain, circumstances still unclear. Lee stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds. Officers present would later describe his face as becoming statuesque. Not angry, not grief-stricken, but simply frozen in the act of processing information that violated fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. Finally, Lee spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. General Jackson wounded by his own troops. God's will be done. Then, more quietly still, as if speaking to himself, he has lost his left arm. I have lost my right. The statement was simultaneously literal and metaphorical. Jackson had indeed lost his left arm, and Lee had lost his most aggressive, most reliable, most irreplaceable corps commander, the man who turned audacious plans into battlefield reality, who understood Lee's intentions before they were fully articulated, who made the impossible routine. The Battle of Chancellorsville would continue for 5 more days. Lee would still win, still force the Union Army back across the Rappahannock, still produce what military historians would call his perfect battle. But the victory would be hollow, achieved at costs that couldn't be measured in simple casualty figures. Because in the span of 3 seconds in a patch of Virginia forest so dark that friend and foe became indistinguishable, the Confederate Army had demonstrated the ultimate truth about war. That even perfect plans executed with perfect precision could be destroyed by the simplest, most human of errors. The soldiers who pulled those triggers weren't villains. They were scared teenagers following reasonable orders based on incomplete information in an environment designed by chaos. They did exactly what they'd been trained to do, and in doing so, they killed the one man the Confederacy couldn't afford to lose. The fog of war hadn't just descended. It had achieved apotheosis, transforming victory into catastrophe with the squeeze of a trigger, proving that in darkness, everyone wears the same uniform. On the morning of May 3rd, the Confederate Army woke to discover it had won a battle and lost a war. The tactical situation was exceptional. Union forces were retreating in disarray. Federal commanders were issuing contradictory orders. Every metric that military analysts used to measure success pointed toward overwhelming Confederate victory. Officers reviewing the morning reports should have been elated. Instead, they moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of mourners at a funeral. Because Stonewall Jackson was dying. He lingered for 8 days in a small office building at Guinea Station, evacuated from the front lines as the battle concluded. The room was sparse, whitewashed walls, a single window, a bed that was too small for his frame. Medical staff changed his bandages, administered what limited pain relief 1863 could provide, and watched helplessly as pneumonia established itself in his weakened lungs. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes loose enough to issue orders to phantom troops, other times simply staring at the ceiling with that perpetually confused expression. On May 10th, Dr. McGuire informed him that death was imminent. Jackson received this news with the same calm he'd shown, receiving battlefield reports. Very good, he murmured. It is all right. His final words, spoken in delirium around 3 that afternoon, were, "Let's cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Then Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall, the man who held his arm up for circulation, who sucked lemons during strategy meetings, who had transformed impossible orders into devastating victories, simply stopped breathing. The Confederacy had survived his wounding. It would not survive his death. The Richmond Examiner broke the story on May 5th under a headline that managed to be both factually accurate and emotionally devastating. General Jackson severely wounded by Confederate fire. The article's author struggled visibly with tone. How does one report that the Army's greatest hero was shot by his own men without either sensationalizing the tragedy or sanitizing it into meaninglessness? The solution was to bury the circumstances in passive voice and strategic vagueness. Through an unfortunate series of nocturnal confusions, General Jackson received severe wounds from forces under his own command. Northern newspapers were less diplomatic. The New York Times ran the story with barely concealed glee, framing Jackson's wounding as divine justice for a traitor brought low by the very army he led. The Philadelphia Inquirer was more measured, but couldn't resist noting the supreme irony of the South's most formidable general being destroyed not by federal tactics, but by Confederate incompetence. What's remarkable about the contemporary reporting is how quickly it moved past the human element. Within days, newspapers on both sides were analyzing the strategic implications. What Jackson's loss meant for Confederate offensive capability, whether Lee could maintain his aggressive posture without his most reliable subordinate. The actual shooting became a footnote, a curious detail in a larger narrative about military capability. Nobody wanted to examine too closely what the incident revealed about the nature of war itself. Major John Berry, the officer who ordered the fatal volley, expected to be court-martialed. He wrote letters to his family predicting his arrest and execution. He composed drafts of official statements explaining his decisions on the night of May 2nd. He prepared himself for the role of villain in a story that demanded someone to blame. The court-martial never came. Robert E. Lee, in what might be his most profound act of leadership during the entire war, refused to assign blame. He understood something that transcends military doctrine, that Berry's decision was not wrong given the information available to him. A general scouting between the lines at night, during a chaotic battle, after his own brigade had already committed fratricide hours earlier. The shooting wasn't a failure of judgment. It was the inevitable outcome of a system pushed beyond human capacity to manage safely. Lee's official report on Chancellorsville mentions Jackson's wounding in a single sentence. No investigation was ordered. No officers were disciplined. The Confederate High Command collectively decided that examining the incident too closely would serve no purpose except to demoralize troops already struggling with the loss. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a recognition that some tragedies resist simple narratives of fault and consequence. Berry survived the war and lived until 1905. He never spoke publicly about that night. When journalists approached him in later years, seeking interviews about the famous incident, he declined politely and firmly. The only record of his private thoughts comes from a letter discovered after his death, written to his daughter. "I gave the order any competent officer would have given. The circumstances were such that not giving it would have been dereliction of duty. And yet, not a day passes that I do not see General Jackson falling from that horse. There are decisions that are simultaneously correct and unforgivable. I made one and have carried it ever since." Here's what the textbooks rarely emphasize. Jackson created the conditions for his own death. His aggressive reconnaissance, his insistence on personally scouting forward positions, his willingness to accept risk in pursuit of tactical advantage. These weren't flaws in his command style. They were the essence of what made him effective. Stonewall Jackson didn't become a legend by being cautious. He became a legend by pushing every advantage to its absolute limit. But limits exist for reasons. The same audacity that produced the flawless flanking maneuver at Chancellorsville also put him on that dark road between the armies. The same refusal to accept conventional wisdom that made his tactics brilliant also made him discount the very real danger of friendly fire in nocturnal chaos. He believed he could control every variable, manage every risk, maintain clarity in the fog of war through sheer force of will and tactical genius. The forest didn't care about his genius. The darkness didn't respect his tactical acumen, and the frightened soldiers of the 18th North Carolina couldn't distinguish between a legendary general and an enemy scout at 30 yards in near total darkness. This is a lesson that resonates across 162 years. Competence is not immunity. Skill does not guarantee safety. You can execute every decision perfectly and still fall victim to circumstances beyond your control. The universe is not a meritocracy where talent and preparation ensure survival. Sometimes you do everything right and die anyway. The Confederacy fought for 2 more years after Jackson's death, but historians broadly agree that something fundamental changed at Chancellorsville. Lee's subsequent campaigns lacked the aggressive edge that Jackson's presence enabled. The invasion of Pennsylvania that culminated at Gettysburg might have unfolded differently with Jackson commanding one of the corps. The defensive struggles of 1864 and 65 might have included more of the devastating counterattacks that were Jackson's signature, but this misses the deeper impact. Jackson's death forced the Confederate High Command to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their army was fragile in ways that couldn't be addressed through training or logistics. It could be destroyed not just by superior federal forces, but by the inherent chaos of combat, by the split-second decisions of scared soldiers, by the fundamental impossibility of maintaining perfect control in imperfect conditions. The shooting shattered the myth of Confederate invincibility, not because it showed weakness. Jackson's flanking maneuver remained a masterpiece of military art, but because it demonstrated that even masterpieces could be destroyed by accidents, that brilliance provided no protection against the random cruelties of war. Every subsequent battle carried this knowledge like a weight. Every night operation, every aggressive maneuver, every calculated risk now came with the unspoken question, what if the best possible outcome still produces catastrophe? What if doing everything right still is enough? Here's what makes this story more than historical curiosity. It keeps happening. Different wars, different technologies, different circumstances, but the same fundamental dynamic. In 1994, American F-15 fighters shot down 2 Army Black Hawk helicopters over Iraq, killing 26 coalition personnel. In 2002, a Canadian pilot bombed American forces in Afghanistan, killing 4 soldiers. In 2003, a British Tornado was destroyed by a Patriot missile battery, killing both crew members. The technology changes. The fog remains. Modern militaries have GPS, thermal imaging, encrypted communications, identification friend or foe systems that would seem like magic to the soldiers at Chancellorsville. Yet friendly fire incidents continue with depressing regularity because the core problem isn't technological. It's human. When you put people in high-stress situations with incomplete information and seconds to make life-or-death decisions, they will sometimes make catastrophically wrong choices while following entirely reasonable logic. The soldier who fired the Patriot missile that killed the British airmen wasn't incompetent. The pilots who shot down the Black Hawks weren't negligent. They were humans operating at the absolute limits of human capacity, in environments that routinely exceed those limits. Stonewall Jackson died because war creates conditions that humans cannot safely navigate, no matter how skilled, how prepared, or how legendary they might be. That was true in 1863. It remains true today. Stand in the Chancellorsville battlefield today, and the forest feels almost peaceful. Well-maintained trails wind through the woods. Historical markers explain troop movements with tidy diagrams. Tour guides describe the flanking maneuver with admiration bordering on awe. It's easy to see the battle as a chess match, a strategic puzzle where Lee and Jackson outmaneuver Hooker through superior planning and execution. Walk 2 miles east of the spot where Jackson fell, marked now by a simple stone monument, and the perspective shifts. The forest closes in. The underbrush thickens. Stand there at dusk, and you can almost feel the darkness that swallowed everything that night. The confusion that turned clarity into chaos, the split second where reasonable decisions cascaded into tragedy. This is what the monument doesn't convey. Jackson's death wasn't an anomaly. It was war functioning exactly as war functions when pushed to its limits. The tragedy wasn't that something went wrong. The tragedy was that everything went right up until the moment it didn't, and there was no way to predict the transition. We study military history searching for lessons, hoping to extract wisdom from catastrophe. But perhaps the deepest lesson is the simplest, that control is an illusion, that fog cannot be dispersed through competence alone, that even legends bleed when shot by their own men in the dark. The 18th North Carolina did nothing wrong. Major Barry gave the correct order. Stonewall Jackson made the decisions as experience, and instinct suggested. Everyone performed admirably within their role. And still, the general died in the dirt, confused until the end about how mathematics could produce such impossible equations. These forgotten lessons fill history's margins, the moments where human systems encounter human limitations and shattered against them. Each story reveals something essential about the gap between our plans and our reality, between our confidence and our vulnerability. If you found this investigation into the archives compelling, join us for the next examination. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss these explorations of how competence, chaos, and tragedy intersect in ways that textbooks rarely acknowledge. Because understanding our past failures might be the only defense we have against repeating them. Though even that, as Jackson might tell you, is no guarantee.